Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. After just 5 months, Dan Ashworth has left his role as sporting director at Manchester United. So why has he gone? And what does it say about the new leadership at the club? Joining us today, we have the Athletic's David Ornstein, Adam Crafton and Laurie Whitwell, who broke the story on Sunday morning. Laurie, let's start with you. Look, like everyone else, I was ready for some Premier League action this weekend. Manchester United playing Nottingham Forest, London Derbies, seeing how it marries up at the top of the table. And the name Dan Ashworth just pops out of nowhere. I mean, this is really, really interesting. Just tell us a bit more. How long has it been going on? Because things are technically looking a bit more stable on the pitch for Manchester United. Why has this happened now?
Yeah, I think it shows the kind of era that we're in when a sporting director leaving a club is absolutely huge news, because, customarily it just wouldn't be. It would maybe be a little bit of interest to the people concerned, but in this situation, I think because so much was made about his arrival at Manchester United, because it had been trailed for so long, 5 months gardening leave, something like that, the compensation to Newcastle, the kind of clubs jockeying for position in the newspapers beforehand as well, and so then for it to come to an end so soon, so suddenly, what it feels like, 5 months into the job, is really striking and seems to have caught the attention of the nation, really. And yeah, I mean, I was enjoying the football to a degree. It was end-to-end stuff. It was entertaining. United lost, obviously, but there was intrigue. You could sort of sense maybe something wasn't quite right in the executive. And then, obviously, I think I've touched on in the piece that we did this morning that Dan Ashworth came through the press conference room after the game, and you sort of wondered, okay, what's that about? And you're sort of picking up little nuggets and thinking, okay, well, Omar Berrada's office is that way. What's going on exactly here? And so, yeah, we were able to get to the story to a completion. We obviously with David and Adam, incredible journalists, my dream team right here. And I think it's been bubbling along. Obviously we touched on in the piece the fact that there's been a bit of disharmony for different reasons. I guess you could say that always might be the case with a new structure coming in. Are they always going to fit together? They'd obviously known of each other, but they hadn't worked together before. You've got different people wanting different influences, having responsibilities, trying to figure all that out. So we can get into the details a bit more as we go on. But yeah, I think it's been, even from perhaps the first stages of all this, there's been a competitiveness around, the executive that, has now come to a point where one of them has left.
Yeah, David, not too long ago, we were singing the praises of Omar Berrada, Dan Ashworth entering Manchester United, and it was quite an interesting podcast, actually. Lots to look forward to. But I guess in terms of who was involved in picking Dan Ashworth in the first place, who would have been in charge of that?
Well, there was lots to look forward to because these are high-level executives trying to embark upon a massive project at Manchester United, and there's still lots to look forward to. They seem to be the gift that keeps on giving at the moment. But this is slightly the nature of the beast when a new setup comes together, with INEOS taking sporting control alongside their significant financial investment in the club, and putting a new set of people in place together. And within that, there's always going to be some teething problems. There's always going to be movement and changes of personnel. They're just not normally as high profile and notable as this. And there may still be some more into the future until they feel they're really settled. And we've seen that at other places. We were on a pod recently where we were talking about Edu leaving Arsenal as sporting director. Yeah, he was 5 years in, but it was still a pretty significant shock to the system. So to your specific question, Dan Ashworth was long linked to this role because he had a prior relationship with Sir Dave Brailsford, with INEOS. They were very familiar with him and his work. Just look back at the comments from Sir Jim Radcliffe about him. They were gushing, 10 out of 10 sporting director, really billed him as being best in class. And I think it was an opportunity that Dan Ashworth wanted as well, which helped facilitate it because things were not going too smoothly at Newcastle. Now, we don't know the exact recommendation and how it came together inside the club. Omar Berrada was appointed as chief executive. He would have had a say in it, of course, and his approval was necessary. But was it him who brought this to the fore? I would suggest it was more on the INEOS side, given what I mentioned about their familiarity. And ultimately, Sir Jim Ratcliffe sanctioned it. And it was a pretty taxing period, if you remember, because Dan Ashworth needed to go on gardening leave. There was a lot of acrimony in relation to potential compensation. Newcastle wanted around £20 million. It ended up being much lower. We think sort of £2 to £3 million as they were battling to comply with PSR before the June 30 deadline. He was looking at taking Newcastle to arbitration. In the end, it wasn't needed, and he got into the building and started on July the 1st. At that point, there was great hopes and expectations of a very long and successful tenure, and that's come tumbling down for a whole manner of reasons that I guess we'll get into now.
Yeah, let's bring in a third part of the dream team, Adam Crafton. Look, club statement says it was mutual consent. I mean, I don't know. We've reported otherwise. Is it mutual consent? Do we have much more on that?
Do I give the diplomatic answer here?
Come on, Adam. Give it to us straight.
Give the Crafton answer. You have to. Come on.
We've seen you on X already, so come on.
I think the reality here is that a guy went to work on Saturday morning, right? Went to Carrington to watch an under-21 game against Sparta Prague, then went to Old Trafford with his family in the evening to watch the game against Nottingham Forest, and left the stadium without a job, right? That's kind of the cut and dry of it. I struggle to believe in that context that that is a completely mutual thing that's happened. Now, when clubs refer to a mutual agreement, that tends to refer to the final agreement, right? Because when somebody leaves an organization, they tend to come to an agreement that might mean they get a certain amount of money, and the employer side might insert certain clauses, the employee side might put in certain clauses. So in the end, everyone says it's mutual because, you know, that's the way that you do it. But was this driven by the INEOS side, the Manchester United side? Absolutely. We know there was a meeting immediately after the game at Old Trafford, which included Omar Berrada. I think we've reported other Manchester United personnel were in that meeting as well. So it's pretty brutal. But I suppose if we just take a step back a bit, as in, why does this matter? Like, why does a sporting director leaving after 5 months at Manchester United, why does it seem so damaging and farcical? It's because for so long, for the past decade, people have been talking about Man United not having, you know, a real sporting direction. It was one of the things when INEOS came in, they said, we need to get our structure right. We need to be really brave about this, really sharp. We're going to go out and we're going to get the best person on the market. We're going to take him from the club that is hypothetically Newcastle, kind of one of the richest in the world, even if they can't spend that money because of PSR at the moment. We're going to go and get him. Even though he's got a job, we're going to get him out of there. We're going to battle to get him out of there, and we're going to do that. And for that to kind of fall apart within a matter of months is pretty farcical. And then if you also bring in that so much of what INEOS have been doing is about cost cutting, is about efficiencies, is about revenue generation, for them to be spending money to get this guy out of Newcastle, and then it's going to cost them money to now let him go, really kind of just undermines them when they're then saying to supporters, we're going to charge you more for ticket prices, when they're saying to every single part of the staff at Man United, you either can't have your job anymore or you need to do your job differently to save money. Well, hang on a minute. What about the judgment of those and the spending of those right at the top of the club? So that's the reason why it matters. And that's the reason why I think so many people across the football industry were pretty stunned when the story came out yesterday.
All valid points, and they will be criticised. They know they will have stick coming their way. It's a pretty messy situation, and we can't get away from that. There's also going to be scrutiny of the initial decision to bring Dan Ashworth in, the due diligence, what they thought they were getting that they don't think they've got now. For example, Dan Ashworth is known as an operations guy, and a very good one at that. Sir Jim Radcliffe has been speaking publicly about how bad he thinks Manchester United's data operation is. The insinuation being that Dan Ashworth should have been better on data. Speak to anybody across the industry, and they don't think Dan Ashworth is a data man. So if that was one of the things that perturbed Sir Jim Ratcliffe, maybe he should have known about it before. But on the bigger picture here, those are all factors, and there are sort of many elements to this decision. But I think the fundamental thing is that Sir Jim Ratcliffe didn't get on with Dan Ashworth, didn't rate him to the extent that he thought he would. And if that is the situation, you need to change that. And maybe INEOS should be given some credit for acting decisively and quickly on something that wasn't working, and a mistake that was made, even a mistake by them. And as they try and embark upon this project that they hope will lead to success and trophies and winning ultimately, some tough decisions need to be made along the way. This is probably the last thing you would have imagined, given the lengths that they went to get Dan Ashworth. And when in recent weeks we were hearing rumblings of a potential change, not everything well, which is not abnormal in these new setups, you weren't immediately thinking Dan Ashworth. You sort of looked towards some other people. Could there be individuals that maybe aren't as necessary now that they've had a bit of time to bed in, but you immediately look towards Dan Ashworth and think, wow. And that's why this, as Laurie pointed out, has become such a big story. But, and we'll come on to talk about this later, you do have to look at the role of a sporting director now, which is the big thing in football. But is it even superseding, what it was meant to be? And as the clubs get bigger and harder to manage with so many different departments and responsibilities, is the traditional sporting director almost being phased out for something different that we might see at Manchester United and elsewhere going forward?
Yeah, Laurie, with all we've said, I'm just thinking about the optics of it all. We talk about hiking ticket prices. You talk about a stadium that still needs building. You talk about a team that still needs a rebuild. All meanwhile, you've got a bunch of fans there, hopeful that a new sort of ownership or part ownership, would try and make things better. What does he say about the optics of it all?
Yeah, and as Adam touched on, I think that's what will sour the executive in the eyes of the fans, because, you had Sir Jim Ratcliffe on the pitch presenting Bruno Fernandes with his 250th appearance, and he got applauded, and that would have been unthinkable with any of the Glazer siblings. They just wouldn't have done it for a start. But I wonder what that reception would be like now for him. And I think that, as you say, the fact that they're making all these redundancies, they're hiking ticket prices unilaterally. It wasn't like there was a consultation about this, and that is, we're told, to sort of raise about 1.5 million over the rest of this season. That pales into insignificance when you set it against the money to sack Erik ten Hag, the money to hire Ruben Amorim, and the money that you paid in compensation for Dan Ashworth. So and I accept that it's going to be, they're coming into a difficult situation. They inherited what I think is a financial mess, and they're still trying to pick their way through that. But obviously these kind of decisions make you think, well, are you getting it right? Are you going to be able to get it right? Because this is kind of fundamental to how they wanted to approach the football club. And I think it does boil down to, sometimes when you get people in the building, maybe you don't, until you get people in the building, you don't know what you're going to find exactly. So obviously there is long-standing relationships there, but when you have the situation that they did with the new head coach being searched for, and Dan Ashworth, from what we're told, wasn't sort of absolutely assertive about who he wanted in place and was kind of providing a list rather than a decisive action, and the kind of people that he was recommending, with Premier League experience, I think we touched on Eddie Howe, Graham Potter, they weren't chiming with what the ownership, what Sir Jim Ratcliffe really, to Dave Brailsford, Omar Berrada wanted. And in the end they've gone for a guy who's won 2 titles in Portugal, who does feel like he's got that charisma that they're desperately after. And it was Berrada that went and did that deal with Sporting over in Lisbon. He had the contacts. It wasn't Dan Ashworth. So if they're coming to that situation and thinking, well, this is such a essential aspect of what we think a sporting director should be doing, then we need to have a conversation around it. And clearly there's other issues. David's definitely touched on some that were obviously crucial to this then coming out now, because you'd be like, well, can't you just figure this through? Can't you work this out? Well, actually they've decided to go, no, it's not working, let's cut it now. But it has sent shockwaves through the club, because he was regarded as the guy that was leading the sporting function at the club. Carrington, a lot of people had respect for him with the way way he went about his work, diligent, hardworking, intelligent, and so it just feels so awkward. Back to your point, Ayo, the optics are just really bad.
Adam, how did the leadership then come to the decision that it was best for Dan Ashworth to leave?
Because they mutually decided that it was the best way forward.
You're doing diplomatic again. Come on,
no,
give me the X answer.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of different things that went into it. So this isn't just one factor. I think if you go back to when Erik ten Hag was under a lot of pressure in the summer, I think that played a part in it, which is a very difficult period to define, because I think at that point Ashworth and even Berrada were still on gardening leave. So at the time, I think it's still fuzzy the extent to which they would have been involved in these decisions. But I think it's fair to say that they were part of the discussions at that time, that where ten Hag in the end was kept on. I think Ashworth in the end appeared to be supportive of that, and also supportive of backing him so substantially in the transfer market. I think the view was, not unreasonably by the way, that once you've kept someone, you kind of have to back him, right? You either get behind this guy or you get rid of him, and they chose to get behind him. I think there's been issues culturally in terms of INEOS, we know, have been doing this wave of cost-cutting, redundancies. I think when INEOS looked at other parts of the club that had been quicker at letting people go, at reducing those headcounts, I don't think that was happening as quickly under Ashworth's department. I think that's it. Laurie, that was in our piece, right? Yeah. That was in our reporting that went out on Sunday night. So, it feels a bit horrible, right? Like this idea that, he just wasn't getting rid of people quickly enough for INEOS's liking, but clearly that is a mission at the moment of the ownership. There's other issues that emerged, during, I don't know if you remember, really towards the start of the season, before Manchester United played Liverpool, there was this media briefing where Omar Berrada and Dan Ashworth spoke to media, started to try and explain what the club had done over the summer, keeping Ten Hag. And Radcliffe, I think, felt that was actually an unnecessary thing to do, to really go out talking after only 2 games of the season. But crucially also within that, the pair of them really distanced themselves from actually the decision to keep Ten Hag publicly. Now, that was a delicate one, because anyone who had been following that situation, I think, would have read that as these guys were on gardening leave, therefore they can't come out publicly and tell their former employees that, yeah, we were really involved during this period where we weren't meant to be doing anything. Radcliffe, however, I think is less concerned about gardening leave as a concept, and was more
absurd. He's called it.
He's called it absurd. And I think he would have looked at that and just thought, why the hell are my management team distancing themselves from this really big decision at this time, and why are they doing that? So those were a few of the issues that went into it. I'm sure the guys can talk about other things. I mean, as Laurie just said about, who they wanted for the next managerial hire. Omar Berrada seemed far more involved than Dan Ashworth. And then there is this Game of Thrones playing out at Manchester United. You have, let's not forget, the majority shareholders are still the Glazer family. Really unclear at the moment what, if any, input they're having to kind of day-to-day decision making. But I knowing,
we're told Joel was involved in this decision, by the way, with Dan Ashworth. Just sort of more than kept in the loop. I don't know. It's difficult to
it's a weird
believe anything other than
when
Jim Radcliffe was the driver behind it.
Yeah, when things go well, we're told it's INEOS, and then when things don't go so well, we're told that Joel's kept in the loop, right? Like that seems to be the way it's going a bit. So the Glazers are still there; they're still the majority shareholders. You've got Radcliffe. You obviously have Omar Berrada, who, really interesting. At the time he was hired, there was a lot of praise for the fact that he was someone who was across football as well as commercial, because it was all about INEOS's, we're putting football first. The club's been, too concerned about commercial. But now it looks a bit as though he's cutting across the football side, which maybe feeds into the sporting direction a little bit. You've then got Jason Wilcox as technical director. You've also then got who else there? You've got head coach. He matters. You've got the head coach's agent previously, I think, was seen as quite influential when Ten Hag was there. But you also have these kind of further figures around INEOS who are having a significant impact. So people like Sir Dave Brailsford, who, but if it was a newspaper, you'd almost describe him as like an editor at large, right? Who is kind of there, just sort of constantly trying to shape the culture of the club. But isn't that the sporting director's role? You've also got other performance consultants who I think are becoming quite influential at United, who are from the INEOS side rather than kind of club staff. So there's lots and lots of different people and different power battles, I think, that have taken place. And Dan seems to be the one that, that has paid the price for that.
I think it's really important for us to say that there's no smoking gun here, as far as we're aware. There isn't some kind of big fallout that we've picked up on that led to this dramatic Saturday night meeting and decision at which Dan Ashworth was essentially informed of his fate before what is being presented as a mutual agreement. Lots of people from across the industry have responded to our story and asked me, wow, there must have been a huge flare-up. Not to our knowledge. I think it's an accumulation of many of the factors that the guys have already gone over right from the start, coming in after the gardening leave, the decision to the decision to continue with Erik ten Hag, the briefing ahead of the Liverpool match, the decision to part with Erik ten Hag and bring in Ruben Amorim, suggestions that we've received that Amorim was not at the top of Dan Ashworth's list and that the likes of Eddie Howe and Graham Potter were in the mix, which seemingly was not to the liking of Sir Jim Radcliffe, the chief executive leading the appointment of the new head coach, as opposed to the sporting director who's meant to be in charge of all of those things. Then you look back on the summer, and we haven't touched upon the transfer window. Another, £200 million spent on a number of signings who you could scrutinise and say they've not worked so far and they might well not work in the future. And ultimately, the recruitment department comes under the sporting structure. So in a way, it's a catalogue, and we've got to be fair here. Like, Dan Ashworth is held in very high regard by many across the industry. And I think the INEOS and United hierarchy too. It's not like they hate him and that he's done something terribly wrong. And he always conducts himself with dignity from what we've seen throughout his career. And so when I speak to people who have held meetings with him inside United, outside United, even very recently, they do have affection for him and they rate his qualities very highly. But it appears that he ultimately has proved not to be what Sir Jim Radcliffe is looking for. And that's why this has had to be brought to an end. They could have waited longer and given it more time, till the summer maybe. But if they're feeling this way now, you may as well get on with it and start to bring about the sort of new look structure that you want and hope will lead you to improvement in the future.
Okay. Well, let's move on because it has been, 10 months into INEOS's control of Manchester United, especially around footballing matters anyway. This is an open one, actually. Laurie, please start. What have you made of INEOS's tenure so far, the last 10 or so months?
All action, isn't it? I thought maybe it would calm down from a journalistic perspective with new owners in, where the kind of fans are more on board and you're getting this sort of sporting structure that the club had been crying out for sure for a long time. But I think what we're realising is that with Sir Jim Radcliffe at the top of it, he's a guy in a hurry, and he's made his billions with extremely shrewd and aggressive business moves, and I think that's what he wants to apply to Manchester United. So we talk about the redundancies, the dramatic cost cutting that's going on, which I think when you even speak to people that are perhaps pushing back against the extent of it, agree that there was too much going on, too much spend going out of the club. But it does boil down to the transfers. The transfers need to be better. That's what is costing United all these millions year after year, and that's what he's touched on in his interview. He did an interview with my good colleague Andy Mitten, United We Stand, Talk the Devil's colleague, where he got into the recruitment, saying that was something that they need to get right, and maybe there was flickers of the Dan Ashworth decision within that, in terms of him talking about mistakes and changes still to come, and the data that David's touched on there. So yeah, I think it's going to be a wild ride, to be honest, because I think, as Adam's touched on, you've got kind of the jockeying still taking place, still people trying to figure out exactly what responsibilities they've got. When you look on the pitch, I do feel like in a guy like Ruben Amorim, I feel like he's somebody that a lot of people can get behind. He has that kind of composure, he has a warmth about him, and I know it's more than that. I know it's about, you know, your tactics and your decisions, but it feels quite a fresh appointment, and I think that's something that people can get behind, certainly. And I know the results haven't quite been there yet. Some of the performances have been decent. We've seen flickers of improvement, but clearly to get United back to, you know, what everybody hopes for. You know, we hear Omar Berrada talk about Project 150, which, you know, 150 years since United were, you know, born as a club. That's 2028. They want to win the Premier League by that point. So that's a bold ambition. Some people will say, why are you even pushing it back to that point? Well, I think it's probably a realistic aim. You know, I don't think they're going to be winning the title next season, but people need to be seeing the building blocks in place, you know, a team improving, because this is all kind of window dressing in a way. You know, I mean, I speak to former players and they say, well, we weren't really fussed about who the sporting director was. We kind of concerned ourselves with the training sessions and what was happening on the pitch, you know, amongst players. So this shouldn't really impact what happens on the pitch. But I do feel like, you know, they obviously need clear direction from, you know, the head coach, who is then supported by, you know, the people around him, you know, the sporting structure, to get the right transfers in. And still the case remains that the financial picture at United is so difficult and tightened because of, you know, we go back to it, the Glazers' leverage takeover that should never have been allowed to happen. But year after year, the debt has, you know, gone up and different money has gone out of the club. And so we're at a point now where United are having to spend on transfers via their revolving credit facility, you know, the company credit card. So that's what slightly concerns me about the future, because to get things right, you will need to spend some money on transfers, and I don't know if the money's there. But yeah, it's certainly been a pretty eventful first year.
Yeah, Adam, can you see the building blocks of what could be a title mount for 2028 so far?
2028. Let's get to 40 points first this season.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Oh, wow, that's deep.
Right? I mean, you know, what is it? One away win all season in the Premier League, Southampton. You know, it's bad. You know, it's bad. You know, it's really bad. Ipswich can't win a game. You know, they drew there. Not putting pressure here, by the way, on Ruben Amorim. He's just inherited an absolute mess. But, you know, I mean, for Man United to be even thinking about titles at the moment, it's just so far away. I think Laurie's right when he says that Jim Radcliffe's in a hurry. You know, man in a hurry. And I think you can see that with the decisions that are being made, and also with the promises that are being made. You know, even, you know, Berrada, it's great to have ambition, right? Everyone should have ambition. It's great to try and unify staff by saying this is where we want to get to, you know, by 3-4 years' time. This is the goal that we have, 150, 2028, great idea. But at the same time, there are challenges and contradictions that I see in the project at the moment. And I think, you know, where Ratcliffe has promised this big new stadium, I think is a really, really big issue, to be honest, because that stadium project is going to cost north of $2 billion if they're going to do a new build. And one of the lessons that we've learned from when Arsenal built a stadium, when Tottenham built a stadium, even when Real Madrid were building a stadium, is it's really, really hard to be competitive on the pitch, right? I'm talking here right at the top in terms of winning titles, winning Champions Leagues, while having to be really, really disciplined in the transfer market at that time, you know, because you're talking about repayments. We're not quite sure how that would even be funded. Can Manchester United, who already borrowed a lot of money, have debt? Can they go and borrow? How much is needed there? Because Jim Ratcliffe's not going to pay for this thing, right? He might put a bit of money in, but he's not going to go and pay for the whole project. And we know the Glazers aren't. So it's going to be a lot of borrowing. It's going to be more interest repayments. That's going to be a really big challenge. And one of the things I just don't understand at the moment, and that nobody at Manchester United is really able to explain, is how do you simultaneously invest in constructing a world-class stadium and a world-class team? And if they don't explain that, that's going to be a really, really limiting factor for them over the next few years. So I wouldn't be amazed, and this isn't based on any information, purely speculating, But I wouldn't be amazed if the talk starts to veer a little bit towards let's focus on getting things right on the pitch rather than, stadium first. That's purely speculation, but I just don't see how you can do both at the same time, given the amount of surgery that is required now on this Manchester United squad, not only based on what we're seeing, but also based on Amorim is clearly going to need players suited to his system. So they're going to have to start trading far better. And I suppose the question now is, with Ashworth leaving, who is actually going to be running that player trading? Because all of this chopping about on the edges, whether it's the staff redundancies, getting rid of company credit cards, apart from the credit cards that pays for transfers, and Christmas parties and all this sort of stuff, it pales into insignificance compared to player trading. They have to buy better and sell better. So who is going to be doing that in January at Old Trafford?
Yes, a good point. And, I don't know if I'm just reading between the lines here, but, we've spoken about how perhaps Omar Berrada's job has sort of encroached into Ashworth's job, David. Is there a sense that perhaps someone like Omar Berrada is seen a bit more trustworthy under this regime than perhaps Dan Ashworth was?
Well, firstly, I think we need to dig out one of Laurie's org charts that he tends to publish on The Athletic to understand exactly who does what.
I keep trying to make these, David. I've been trying to make one since INEOS came in. I keep getting delayed and told it's still a work in progress, and now we know why it was a work in progress.
Talk about movable feast. So Omar Berrada clearly is very highly thought of by the INEOS regime. So Jim Radcliffe, he was heavily involved in Manchester City's rise, and they made an audacious move to bring him in just under a year ago. And then he eventually started after his own gardening leave spell. I guess it would have been a difficult moment. We've talked about the briefing ahead of the Liverpool game, which Jim Radcliffe seems to have taken a dim view on in relation to Dan Ashworth. Well, that was given by Omar Berrada as well. So I don't think that was a moment that anybody involved will look back on with much pride, given how things have unravelled. However, everything you hear of suggests that they have total faith in Omar Berrada to grow and to drive this forward. And they trust him to be at the wheel and to lead this with his sort of quite unique skill set of being able to straddle the business side of the operation and also the football. But he, like everybody else, will have to deliver in what's clearly shaping up to be a pretty ruthless regime. And maybe Sir Jim Ratcliffe has shown that in his other operations with INEOS and his business pursuits. It begs a really interesting question about how that all looks now in terms of the hierarchy. And so Ratcliffe clearly is quite hands-on, despite putting people in place to run operations. He's got Jean-Claude Blanc there, who's very experienced in football, but I don't know how much involvement he has in everything at Man United. You've got Sir Dave Brailsford there, who, of course, is head of sport for INEOS, and I think is going to be increasingly involved in Manchester United operations. Omar Berrada as chief executive, and he'll be supported by Jason Wilcox, increasingly so, I would imagine, technical director. He's occupied the sort of job on his own at Southampton previously, and a very good reputation from Manchester City. We're told that Ruben Amorim gets on really well with him. Maybe it's an ex-player thing, and so perhaps he becomes more prominent. Alongside them, you have Christopher Vivell, who is head of or director of recruitment. And so although it was presented as a temporary appointment, he'll be heavily involved in January and whatever they do, which might not be very much. And of course, moving towards the summer. And let's see how long he's continued for on what's said to be a relatively short contract. Alongside him, you have Matt Hargreaves, who's head of negotiations. And from what I've heard across the industry, he's quite well thought of, and the Man United hierarchy think he's been doing a good job in the negotiations and building connections with agents, with clubs, with players, with families. And so there is some rhyme to the reason. You've got Colette Roach there as COO in the mix too, and Darren Fletcher was kept on in a slightly different role. So you do see a sort of a family tree shaping up, but within all families, there tend to be a few tensions.
Sounds like the worst Thanksgiving ever. Or that, that might have gone on over the past few weeks. But also, I have a question. One of the things that INEOS were really big on when they first came in, they were talking about there's going to be this game model that comes from the club, right? That INEOS wanted that because they've seen the way that other clubs have tried to adopt a game model that is reflected in all aspects of the club. But now the club has a new manager that's come in with a very, very specific system, looks like a very specific game model. Is that now a club-wide game model, something they're going to do in the academy, in the under-21 team? Like, Laurie, what's happened with the idea that the club would drive the game model, a game model which I presume means a style of play, principles of play. But what's happened with that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I was actually speaking to somebody about this at the weekend, and it was interesting to note that Erik ten Hag picked up on those words. I think it might have even been in a newspaper report rather than communicated by INEOS, and he started saying game model at the end of last season, and then Ruben Amorim has mentioned it as well in one of his press conferences. So clearly it's something that is being discussed internally, and yeah, you might say, well, he plays a back three, that's a very different game model to a back four. I think the idea behind it is that it's sort of principles of play. So it's having, high press. It's having athletic players that can actually run around a lot, which is obviously something that Ruben Amorim it seems to have an issue with, and goes back to recruitment and goes back to player profiling. So I think this sort of principles of play that are this game model, they want to have entertaining football, right? Old Trafford, they don't want to have a deep line defence where they can kick the ball along in a back three or a back four. So I think that's the idea, that you can have these sort of certain styles of play within a team, and okay, it varies depending on what players are on the pitch and what formation it is, but essentially, even if you're, I don't know how this does work though from manager to manager. If another manager comes in and wants a back four, surely a fullback is going to be different to a wing back in terms of the essential characteristics. So I do have questions about that. And also, I think Jason Wilcox, the technical director, that's his role, right? To sort of set the game model. You might ask a question. He's not really, I don't think, done that anywhere else that he's been. So at Man City, it was the academy and sort of doing deals there and kind of setting the tone for the academy. Southampton was a year, picked Russell Martin. And to be fair, that obviously is a very clear game model, I think you would say, in terms of what they're trying to do at Southampton. So you can understand maybe why he's been assigned that particular role. But I would be fascinated to know the kind of conversations that go on, because any head coach worth his salt will have a very clear mind about what he wants his team to play like, and clearly Ruben Amorim does. But and just finally to your point about the academy, because I've been asking about this as well, sort of will they play a back three? They actually did play a back three in the game on Saturday that Dan Ashworth attended against Sparta Prague. I believe that was because of the players that they had at their disposal, rather than a kind of an agenda to play the Amorim way. But we'll see as we go along. You could understand an academy coach wanting to try out these players in these positions so that they are then ready potentially for the first team.
Does that not bring us back full circle to Sir Jim Ratcliffe's apparent bugbear of data?
That was my next question, the data analysis aspect of things. Go for it, David. Yeah.
One word not mentioned there, and it seems to be something that's doing the rounds now off the back of Ratcliffe's interview with United We Stand. And it's not that United don't have a data operation. It's just that he doesn't rate it, from what he's seen and been told, as highly as the data operations at other clubs and sporting organizations that are, as we know, incredibly advanced, and it's kind of helping lead towards success. And that makes me wonder if, when everybody's talking about who will replace Dan Ashworth, maybe he's not replaced, and maybe that what they try to do is bolster in a slightly different way. They could have a reshuffle of existing staff because of those I mentioned before, having qualities and capabilities to cope post Ashworth. Already we were hearing suggestions that Man United INEOS felt that the setup was too bloated and it needed to be made more lean, which is, again, a repercussion of new setups often, that you almost over-recruit and then slim down. And then if you were to bring some data experts in and really try and bolster that operation, one, it may be less costly than the expense of appointing a renowned sporting director, but also it may be a little bit more fit for purpose in terms of the modern era and exactly what Manchester United need. And you only need to look at what the Liverpools and Manchester Cities and Brightons and others who are making strides in this are looking to do to sort of understand that it might not be as glamorous as the big sporting director. And it brings me back to a point I mentioned earlier about this all-encompassing sporting director. They now have to, look after the entire football department. They have to support the manager or head coach. They have to lead on recruitment. They have to be all over and proficient at data analysis. And, it's a club that is absolutely enormous. And perhaps you split it up going forward. And that's what I'm hearing from speaking to sporting directors at other clubs. Firstly, they've got much lower headcounts than Manchester United. And that is something that INEOS, Jim Radcliffe, seem determined to continue with whatever level of hurt it produces to the human beings involved. And it's said that they were dissatisfied with how much chopping Dan Ashworth had done in that football department so far. But when I speak to clubs that have much lower headcounts, they're much more efficient in the use of their resources than Manchester United have been, and much more ready for 2024, 2025 and beyond. And so I do think that's
David, I think there's a misunderstanding as well but I think amongst many football fans and media as well about what exactly a sporting director is. I think sometimes we just think it's the dude who's sitting there signing players or choosing the manager, and that's a part of the job. But as you say, it's the medical side, it's the performance side, it's also had oversight of the women, all of these aspects on both the men's and the women's side, the academy, the player care team, all of this kind of pre-season, how you organize that, how the training, big training center projects at the moment, all that kind of stuff. I suppose the only bit around the data side that jars a little is, on the one hand, we have Ratcliffe saying our data's not good enough. On the other hand, when Ashworth was asked, who should be the manager, and he says, well, we're going to need to take some external data advice, INEOS seems to have a problem with that, right? It was you should just know. Well, actually, surely you shouldn't just know, because we want decisions to be based on evidence and data. So, those are different stories that we're hearing at different points. But I don't know. There's times I listen to INEOS and Ratcliffe, and I think they're very forward thinking. And there's other times where they seem very actually old school in terms of you should just know and let's get on with it.
And is this part of the jeopardy, I guess, Laurie, with INEOS had not operated, Sir Jim Radcliffe, Sir Dave Brailsford, and you hear some things really complimentary about them. You hear some things that need to be learned upon. You look at Nice and Lausanne and the cycling operation, the America's Cup, and so on, and remind ourselves that this is new. That not only the Premier League and operating in football in this country, but the size and the scale and the importance of Manchester United and the scrutiny of every decision and the media coverage and the sort of fan expectation, not just on the ground, but all over the world. And they're kind of learning on the job, and mistakes will be made along the way, and there's no guarantee of success, and they're fighting against operations across the Premier League in Europe, many of whom are already advanced and progressing and flourishing. So it's not an easy task that they've got on their hands either.
No, for sure. And I think you touched on a really important point there with the scrutiny, because these guys are human. I mean, I know that Sir Jim Ratcliffe carries himself in a very confident way. He absolutely should be, what he's been able to achieve in life. But I think even he surely will be a bit taken aback by the kind of level of attention that you get at Manchester United. I guess you want that because it translates to money, but I think there's people in there that have been, surprised maybe at the scale, and you're going to get that, and the kind of attention. Obviously Ruben Amorim's touched on it, hasn't he? The amount of interviews that he's had to do, a little bit tongue in cheek perhaps, because he's kind of making the point that he wants to concentrate on his coaching and doesn't want to have to be talking about what he wants to do. He wants to just actually go and do it. But I do think it's a real thing that a club like Man United has got such high expectations, such history and heritage to try and achieve, yet the reality is just there's a gap there, and trying to blend those two things together is really tricky.
Can I just say quickly, look, Adam, what Sir Jim Radcliffe, 27.7% of Manchester United, and the Glazers just laughing because this is a lot of work for such a small stake that you're buying into a club. I'm just watching it going, we're talking about this, and there's a whole heap of work to be done here for a very small stake of the club.
Yeah, and that's the bit where, if INEOS and Ratcliffe are so clever, right?
This isn't a great deal. You're going to say, go on.
How is it so smart to pay 1.3 billion to be a minority shareholder? Because ultimately, the people who are going to benefit the most from this, if it goes well, are the Glazer family. And also, don't forget, there are those, very, very unlikely that this would come into effect, but there is the possibility, I think, is it first 12 to 18 months, Laurie, that if someone else came in and said to the Glazers, we want to buy the lot, they could just drag everyone out of there, which is kind of extraordinary, which makes you think that it is a passion project, vanity project for Ratcliffe, as much as it is a smart investment. I know he's previously said, we don't make decisions based on that, but I think there is a little bit of, he's in his 70s, he's made his money, he says it's the club that he's supported all his life, therefore why not go and do this, go and have the power. I suppose the interesting bit is, like, how long would the Glazers allow, and we're in very early stages here, but how long would the Glazers allow things to not go well? Because ultimately it is their value from a majority perspective that is also being depreciated. But as far as I know, like, the Glazers are not, they are standing off here, but I think they are still across certain aspects of the club. It's not a complete, just go and do absolutely whatever you want completely. But I think from a football operations point, and to be fair, the business operations as well, they have said, okay, go on, guys, see what you can do. Whether there is a red line to that, a point at which they'll say, they'll call them in after a game and say, sorry, guys, this isn't working, I don't know. But at that point, it would become very, very messy, because INEOS Ratcliffe would still own 27.7%. And I think that is the nature of the shareholding, I think, is another issue when it comes to, if Man United want to go and sign a player this summer and the books aren't looking great and it needs some owner investment, does Ratcliffe do owner investment without getting more equity? Because that's what we saw when he put in the 300 million for the training ground stadium infrastructure. His shareholding went from 25% to 27.7%. So it's almost like, if I'm making an investment, well, I want more equity. But that's not how it normally works when you have a majority owner. They just put the money in. So that side of it's messy. And I think that's where it gets even more messy on the stadium project, because that money is not going to be borrowed against INEOS. Because why would INEOS take that risk for something that's a 27% shareholding? So there's lots of questions about the ownership and how that all works. And I'm fascinated to know, like, at what point was Joel Glazer told over the last week, oh yeah, by the way, that guy that we fought really hard to get out of Newcastle, yeah, he's out, right? How did that work? It's like totally fascinating. Would have loved an Amazon documentary on Manchester United this season.
Right now,
maybe that's the only thing that could actually just clear up their financial problems.
Yeah, that's a £500 million deal, surely.
worth its weight in gold, the way it's going.
Yeah. All right, let's quickly move on. David, this one's probably for you, really. We're talking about sporting directors. Arsenal are on the shop for a sporting director. Do we have any sense of where Dan Ashworth might end up in general, or where his movements might take him?
firstly, we don't know the terms of his exit in terms of severance and non-competes and restrictions and covenants within the agreement that has been presented as mutual. And
Wait. Sorry. So now INEOS would be into gardening leave?
roles reversed. It's come full circle. That's just something that's pretty standard, clearly, as they've found out to their costs in departures of high-profile individuals. We can't speculate too much without knowing. And in normal circumstances, there would be something stopping Dan Ashworth, somebody in that role, going and working for a Premier League rival if he has received a payoff. That would be pretty standard. So we'll have to wait and see. There's obviously rumblings within the industry of people putting two and two together, because Richard Garlick is the managing director at Arsenal now. He was number 2 and very close to Dan Ashworth at West Bromwich Albion earlier in their careers, and Arsenal have a vacancy post-Edu. But we don't know of anything developing there, and you could probably draw links between Dan Ashworth and other vacancies too. So there may be a bit of logic, but it's not in sight. And, we've talked about other names that could be in the frame for Arsenal when Olave left Real Sociedad, Andrea Berta leaving Atletico Madrid. There are some competent, capable people on the market. In theory, Mikel Arteta's said to be likely to have a significant say in this. Would he want somebody like Dan Ashworth? What is his preference? The decision is far more nuanced and intricate than that sort of supposition, and they'll have help from recruitment firms. I think it's Nolan Partners working with Arsenal, so they've got time. They've got Jason Ato, who's in position at the moment, holding fort, and I suspect he's in the mix and under consideration with others. Dan Ashworth will presumably take some time off to lick his wounds. Let's see when he's able to come back to work or not, but also to reflect on what's been a pretty chastening experience. And it's not nice to see your job ended in this way so quickly, something that many people felt he was destined for, Manchester United, that it was almost like the so-called best in class in English football going to the biggest English club. And they saw this for many years, and it's already fallen apart in just 5 months. And so that might take some coming to terms with. We've seen Gareth Southgate, post-England manager job, talking about maybe going into different industries or different parts of the industry and different jobs. We simply don't know. But he's got a skill set that really is appreciated, whether it be West Brom, England, Brighton, Newcastle, Manchester United. He's very employable. He's young. He's got good relationships across the industry. And so there will be opportunities that arise for him at clubs, international level, and maybe outside of football. Right now, we don't know. And it may take a bit of time before any of that starts to become clear.
With Ashworth leaving, where does this leave the pressure? We should talk about the pressure cooker that is Manchester United and that next appointment and those decisions moving forward. Because as Adam stated, Laurie, Amram's still's got to do his work on the pitch. He's still got to bring some players in. He's still inherited a squad. But in terms of the machine that is Manchester United, just how far back has it sort of set them?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, I suppose, what Dan Ashworth was doing exactly, and whether people can pick that up straight away, or whether it really does require a bit of time to recalibrate. I think that the actual it's a setback because, and obviously it's slightly embarrassing for all concerned, but I think it's, in terms of the actual functionality, it's a setback because INEOS came in with an idea that the sporting director would shape the club, and then the head coach would report into him. So obviously Ten Hag was a manager, Ruben Amorim is a head coach, so that kind of fits that sort of prototype in terms of what INEOS want. But so yeah, how does that then reconfigure itself? It'd be fascinating to see. Like I say, I do get a suggestion that you've got other people there that can pick up the slack, and maybe they just kind of look at things different way. But it certainly, I suppose it doesn't. If people can pick up, then it doesn't necessarily put them back too much. It's just that I think it's the optics, really. It's the sense that, okay, well, we want to trust you guys. We want you to get this right. But at the same time, if this is the first big decision that you've accepted sort of was a mistake, I don't know, does the faith is tested then in that scenario?
Okay, for sure. Gents, really appreciate your time. Adam, David, and Laurie as well. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcast from.